Recall that the strategy of an enterprise identifies how an organization will function in its environment. Organizational strategy specifies how to satisfy customers. Satisfy customers, grow business, compete, manage, achieve financial goals.
Where do you start when building an organization's strategy? The best place to start is to envision what the future should look like, or to begin with the end in mind.
Goals of organizational strategy. Whatever strategy the corporation adopts to satisfy customers, grow, compete, organize itself, and make money, the supply chain has to operate in a manner that furthers those goals. To give a simple example, if customers are clamoring for deeply discounted prices on durable, high-volume goods with stable demand, a supply chain strategy that focuses on low-cost sourcing and/or capital expenditure with justified ROI, return on investment, would be on target to accomplish that goal. In the case of equipment investments, ROI would need to come in the form of lower labor costs or increased economies of scale. Horizontal supply chains will contain a number of independent organizations, each with its own goals, processes, operations, technology, and strategy. So when we refer to the necessity of aligning supply chain strategy with organizational strategy, we are referring to the strategies of a channel master or nucleus firm. Traditionally, that's the manufacturer of a product, the company that sits right at the center of the supply chain, or network, with suppliers in tiers on one side and customers on the other. However, if a supply chain has a dominant company with a dominating strategy, one that is dictating its requirements to others, for example, a large retailer, then supplier and manufacturer strategies and goals must align with that retailer's organizational and supply chain strategies. The suppliers of suppliers also have strategies to be brought into alignment. Finally, the strategies, once aligned, have to do two things: serve the end customer's needs and be profitable for the supply chain as a whole and each company individually. The following looks at 4 types of organizational strategy in detail: customer focus and alignment, forecast-driven enterprise, demand-driven enterprise, and product-type-driven supply chains. Strategy, customer focus and alignment. Organizations with a customer focus and alignment prioritize what's good for the customer, not what's good for the nucleus company or even what seems to be good for the supply chain itself. The matching supply chain strategy, therefore, needs to be focused on giving the final customer the right product at the right time and place for the right price. It isn't necessarily about the most advanced product or service, nor is it always about the lowest price, the fastest time, or the most convenient place. It's about the balance of quality, price, and availability, timing and place, that's just right for the customer. How does one determine what is the right amount of each of those factors? There isn't a simple formula that will help the organization with this decision, but there are some basic premises that will help supply chain managers get started in determining the appropriate balance to enable this strategy. Serving the end-user customer is the primary driver of supply chain decisions. Organizations in the supply chain have to make a profit and stay in business to serve the customer. Functional teams in the organization will provide their input and research on the optimal balance for the supply chain to meet customer needs. Design engineers, or better yet, design teams from across the network, design products that are right for the end customer and can be sold profitably. Market research looks for the true and not always obvious needs in potential consumers that the supply chain can be engineered to satisfy profitably. Logistics strategy begins with data about customer demands for availability of materials, components, service, or finished products, depending upon the customer, and then it looks for ways to move products in a cost-effective way with acceptable risk. Decisions are not just about product features or price or speedy delivery. They are about the right features at the right price on the right schedule. Back in 1981, Microsoft's DOS was not a great operating system. It was just the right operating system for the time and the market. The term customer can be a complex concept in relation to supply chains because there are multiple customers with different stakes in the process. When we talk about customer focus, we mean the end user, the consumer of the product. But usually, only the retailer actually sees the end user and has a direct relationship with that person or entity. Everyone else in the supply chain has a more immediate customer just downstream before one gets to this ultimate customer. If the supply chain is completely aligned in its focus on the end customer, then, at least in theory, serving the customer just to an organization's downstream side would automatically serve the end user and also be in the supplying organization's best interest as well as the interest of investors. Moreover, within each supply chain partner, there are internal customers whose needs also must be aligned with corporate and supply chain strategies. Each manager must understand his or her role in making the supply chain profitable, and staff too must be rewarded, motivated, and trained in alignment with the needs of the supply chain's end customer. Consider sustainable supply chain management, which is basically a supply chain that works to maximize the positive, long-term social and environmental impact of its actions while remaining profitable. Successfully managing for sustainability requires a strategic mindset involving numerous personnel and financial resources and a commitment from suppliers from first to lower tiers of the supply chain, as well as consumers further up the supply chain. Departments must cooperate with other departments in their organization, for example, purchasing and environmental or design departments, and with their counterparts at suppliers. This type of collaboration between supply chain partners necessitates breaking down cultural barriers and building a culture of trust to ensure that the focus is on end-to-end supply chain activities and not just discrete supply chain processes. Creating and managing a sustainable supply chain requires an organization to be informed, exercise leadership, and cooperate with all supply chain partners in achieving positive results on the triple bottom line, which is a sustainability management system discussed in Module 3, Section A, that adds environmental and social goals and metrics to the traditional economic goals and metrics to produce profitable sustainability. Strategy: forecast-driven enterprise. The first organizational strategy we discussed was the customer focus and alignment. A second organizational strategy is the forecast-driven enterprise. Simply put, this strategy is one in which the nucleus company, usually the manufacturer, utilizes a forecast, an estimate of future demand, as the basis of its organizational strategy. Here is the complicating factor. It is difficult to know what customer requirements will be from day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter, and so on. For instance, if a manufacturer was guaranteed that its wholesale or retail customers were going to need 1,000 SKUs every Wednesday afternoon, then getting those products to customers at the right time and place would be a matter of simple calculation based on lead times for production and delivery. In turn, the manufacturer would look at the bill of material, determine the lead time for each, and submit schedules to its suppliers. Unfortunately, it's difficult to predict even the most stable demand, say for a product like diapers. There is some variability in demand for diapers, even though they're not subject to seasonal style changes or rapid peaks and valleys in response to outside influences affecting ability to pay. That's why Procter & Gamble cooperates with Walmart to plan for demand and replenishment of diapers. The chain of demand begins at the far retail end of the supply chain and works its way back toward the source of raw materials used in making the product. The traditional way of attempting to satisfy this demand is to forecast it. In this retail example, forecasting along the supply chain works like this. The retailer forecasts demand from parents who purchase diapers. The wholesaler forecasts demand from all its retailers. The manufacturer forecasts demand from the wholesale distributors. The component suppliers forecast demand from the manufacturers. The raw material suppliers forecast demand from the component manufacturers. How effective is this strategy? Let's say you don't want to be placing large bets on the accuracy of all those forecasts. Here's what typically happens. Parents vary their diaper buying patterns in fairly small increments due to factors nobody fully understands. They may go to different stores for a change, shop on Tuesday instead of Wednesday, or buy 2 or 3 weeks worth at one time because the diapers are on sale. So actual demand never quite meets the forecast. Meanwhile, the retailer had already ordered enough to allow a little extra safety stock to put in its storeroom. Or maybe the retailer runs a promotion that is not communicated to the distributor, thus resulting in needing a larger order than was previously forecasted. These fluctuations impact forecasting for the distributor. The wholesale distributor had forecast demand based on past orders from its retailers. But now those demand patterns have a wider variability than the demand pattern at the retailers, just at the checkout counters, due to that safety stock the retailer held onto. Sometimes the safety stock accumulates because demand is less than the forecast, and this means that the retailer's next order is less than its forecast. Or perhaps it doesn't have to order at the usual time at all because it has a glut of diapers, which it probably sells off in a promotion. The upshot of all of this is that the small variations in end-user demand are magnified at the distributor. Up the supply chain, the manufacturer of those diapers looks at the demand pattern from the distributor and makes its own forecasts, which show an even wider swing in variability. And this variability goes up the supply chain with ever wider swings. This pattern of variability is called the Bullwhip effect, and it affects all manner of supply chains that are based on serial forecasting by each independent division or company that touches the product as it travels from raw material to finished retail item. Strategy: demand-driven enterprise. The next organizational strategy we'll look at is the demand-driven enterprise. The bullwhip effect is driven by demand forecasts. The solution is to replace the forecasts with actual demand information. This isn't necessarily a simple matter either, but supply chain professionals have evolved techniques for letting actual orders, not forecasts, drive production and distribution. In the demand-driven supply chain, supply management is focused on customer demand. Instead of manufacturers planning their operations based on factory capacity and asset utilization, the demand-driven supply model operates on a customer-centric approach that allows demand to drive supply chain planning and execution, moving the push-pull frontier, as it's called, back up the supply chain at least to the factory. Instead of producing to the forecast and sending finished products to inventory, the production process is based on sales information. There is, in other words, no fixed production schedule in a strictly demand-driven supply chain. Product is turned out only in response to actual orders, on demand, in other words. This often leads to a decrease in lead times due to the ability to better anticipate incoming orders from the retailer. Note, however, that on the supplier side of the plant, forecasts still determine delivery of raw material. The art of forecasting remains crucial, even in a demand-driven supply chain. This is also known as a pull system, and it entails the following. In production, the production of items only as demanded for use, or to replace those taken for use. In material control, the withdrawal of inventory as demanded by the using operations. Material is not issued until a signal comes from the user. In distribution, a system for replenishing field warehouse inventories, where replenishment decisions are made at the field warehouse itself, not at the central warehouse.
Thank you for watching us. Please like, share, and subscribe the Expertise Station channel.